Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Amanda Edelman, Deputy General Manager of Chicago and COO of the Gen Z Lab at Edelman. Today, and all this month, we're diving into the political voice of a generation that is reshaping our democracy, Gen Z. Gen Z has grown up in an era defined by crisis, and that reality has shaped them into one of the most politically active and outspoken generations in history. The 2025 Edelman Trust Barometer found that more than half of young adults, including Gen Z, approve of hostile activism as a way to drive change. Amid a crisis of grievance, Gen Z channels their discord into both skepticism and mobilization. Few writers have tracked the evolution of Gen Z as closely as Rachel Janfaza. Rachel, who is among this generation, has spent years covering youth and politics with a focus on how Gen Z organizes, mobilizes, and makes its voice heard. Rachel first made her mark reporting for CNN on the 2020 election, where she chronicled the rise of young activists and the ways they were rewriting the rules of civic engagement. Now, through her independent newsletter, The Up and Up, she continues to bring clarity to how Gen Z, and even younger Gen Alpha, are stepping into politics with a mix of urgency, skepticism, and creativity. Rachel, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Thank you so much for having me, Amanda. I'm excited to be here.
So thrilled to have you. I want to rewind the clock quite a bit to 2020, and I actually want to start with how this started for you. I would love to hear a little bit of the origin story. What made you so interested in covering Gen Z, and what did you do to sort of start with it?
So I always felt like Gen Z, the generation that I was a part of, had a really different relationship with politics and activism than that of any generation prior. And my 4 years of college were the 4 years of President Donald Trump's first term in office. And as a student, there was so much campus activism at the time that I was paying attention to and I started to write about. So I wrote my senior thesis on the role of social media in youth-led social movements, looking across the past decade, which at the time was between 2010 and 2020, and the way that social media had propelled social movements during that time. So I did 4 case studies. I looked at the Dreamers movement, the Black Lives Matter movement pre-2020, the March for Our Lives, and gun safety activism and climate activism, and the way that different technologies from Facebook to YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram were used throughout that time. You'll notice I didn't mention TikTok because TikTok was not a thing. The moment I turned in my thesis, it was outdated because that was right when students were being kicked off campuses at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the entire political conversation for this generation flipped on a dime. So from then, I started covering young voters at CNN. That was my first job out of college. I actually started technically before graduating while on lockdown from my parents' house. And I was talking with young people across the country by phone and Zoom about the way they were feeling in the lead up to the 2020 election. And then, as you mentioned, ever since.
I find that so prescient, and this really mirrors our own experience with the Gen Z Lab, is that we started at the end of 2020 into early 2021 because so many of our clients were talking about it and they were so concerned about this generation. Who are these people who are up and coming in the workforce, are now buying our products, are really vocal on social media? Are they going to cancel me? And for a lot of our clients, there's quite a disconnect between, just from an age perspective, between them and this generation. For you, though, as you say, you're sort of part of Gen Z. Was there anything as you started to report on Gen Z, talk to more people, was there anything that surprised you?
I think that Gen Z on the whole feels a very intimate relationship to politics and politicians, in part because of the proximity they feel they have to others via social media. And I think our generation's relationship, not just to politics, but to workplace culture, to dating culture, to the economy, all of these different facets of our society, we have a unique perspective on it because of the way that social media has shaped our consciousness. And so when thinking about current events, world events, and politics in particular, the experience of being able to witness someone else's perspective in real time as an event is unfolding, I believe has been crucial to the way that Gen Z conceptualizes the political experience and has developed their own political ideology. And what I mean by that is the ability to watch an event in real time through your phone screen, chronicled by someone else who is your same age or maybe a little bit older or younger, and being able to see how they are reacting to it in the very moment that it's happening has created this intimacy to issues that may have previously felt removed or like they were happening in another world, and has allowed for young people to really witness that up close. It is a parasocial relationship, and so there are certainly downsides to that as well. And I think it has clouded understanding and just kind of the awareness that people may think they have, when in reality it might be clouded through the phone screen. But it also has allowed for young people to really develop a worldview in a way that has just markedly different than any generation prior. At the same time, I think that they also feel that they are in this close proximity to leaders as well, because they have the ability to see their lives in real time and also to call out leaders by publicly shaming them via social media or publicly applauding them and praising them. And of course, there's been the rise of cancel culture and as a result. So the relationship to social media has completely, I think, defined our generation's outlook and is also what differentiates us from any generation prior.
I love that. And one thing that I'm struck by in hearing you answer this question is just the tensions within Gen Z and sometimes the cognitive dissonance even. I love that you use the term intimacy. I had never thought of it that way. I think that is spot on and is correct. And it's funny that this is a generation defined by intimacy with authority figures when, in fact, they're quite lonely and isolated. People talk a lot about the lack of connection. And in some ways, algorithms and social media help you do both things. They help you be more empathetic and see more into people's lives, but also can somewhat keep you isolated and in your own thought bubble rather than hearing different perspectives. And the other point that you said that I also found was an interesting tension was on the sort of powerlessness and power of Gen Z. And that's something that we see a lot. On the other hand, there is a feeling of powerlessness amongst this generation of fixing structures that deeply affect them, whether that's social issues, whether that's governance, policy. And this, I think, is a sort of fundamental, interesting tension for this generation is the we versus the me. When we first launched the Gen Z Lab in 2021, this generation was about the power of we. It was all about the collective. It was all about using social media to mobilize for change. You're mobilizing your community, your peers, your people around you. It's these sort of broad issues that people were looking to address. Now, though, the way the world has shifted, Gen Z is really defined by me. Not just Gen Z, really the whole world, but Gen Z is at the arrowhead of that. They're much more about how are you fixing my life? How are you making my life better? And this is really a seismic change. And so my two questions from this are, number one, do you agree? Does this sort of corroborate what you're listening and hearing to? And then the second part is that I know one of the big things you have started to talk about and actually coined is this idea of Gen Z 1.0 versus Gen Z 2.0. And I don't want to give away too much because I think you'll be able to explain it much better than me. But I wonder if this divide, the we versus the me, is actually an indicator of a divide within Gen Z and what people prioritize.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot to unpack there. As you mentioned, I developed this theory of the two Gen Zs, Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0, as I like to call them. And this was the result of listening sessions with hundreds of young people across the country and one-on-one conversations over the past many years. It really started to crystallize after the 2022 midterms when I started doing in-person listening sessions on high school campuses, college campuses, and community centers. And the dynamics in the way that young people at the time started talking about their lives and their worldview was very different than that cohort that I had described as the activists on campus during the first Trump administration. And I started to think about, okay, there's clearly these very two different perspectives and experiences. What has contributed to this? And the COVID-19 pandemic was the biggest glaring world event that I could think of that had really splintered this generation into two sub-generations. So to give a little overview, the way that I define the two Gen Zs is that Gen Z 1.0 accounts for anyone who had graduated high school and had a taste of independence prior to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Gen Z 2.0 accounts for anyone who was still in high school, maybe they were about to graduate, and younger during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Gen Z 1.0 is anyone between the ages of 27 and 22. And Gen Z 2.0 really is anyone younger than 22. And that age frame doesn't exactly encapsulate everyone. Of course, people are in different grades than their age, and it's not a perfect science there, but that's roughly the age frame. But to go back to just sort of the idea of what Gen Z 1.0 is and what Gen Z 2.0 is and why I see these subgenerations as unique is we've been historically, societally categorizing generations in this 15-year time frame that I think has not kept up with the speed of technology and the many crises, as you described at the start of this podcast, that have shaped the lives of our generation. For Gen Z 1.0, when they were growing up, TikTok wasn't a thing. When I was in high school and college, it didn't exist. And only at the end of my college experience was it on the App Store. For Gen Z 2.0, they only know a world where TikTok is one of the primary social media platforms. And TikTok has changed our entire culture. It has allowed trends to go viral. It has allowed songs to become popular and artists to gain relevance. And it has also changed the way that we speak and the cadence of our conversations. That's just one example. I think if you look at politics in particular, Gen Z 1.0 grew up with President Obama in office and maybe remembers a time when President Bush was in office. But for Gen Z 2.0, President Trump is the only point of reference. And Gen Z on the whole has only been able to vote in elections where President Donald Trump is on the ballot. But that relationship to a period of time where Trump wasn't a part of the political zeitgeist is really different for Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0. And then the other biggest thing is the COVID-19 pandemic and the role that it's had on society and also our education and therefore our upbringings. So Gen Z 1.0, for most of their lives, had a normal pre-COVID academic experience. But for Gen Z 2.0, so much of their academic experience has been defined by the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that we learned since then. So whether it was remote learning, lockdowns, having classes on Zoom, having a time where they weren't allowed to socialize with their friends, where they were coming of age and at this super key moment in time, those middle school or early high school years, where that's when you're developing yourself, your sense of self, your identity, going through puberty. That was when they were locked down in their homes and not allowed to socialize and missing all of these important life moments and even just day-to-day experiences of being a K through 12 student. And the result of that has really created a subgeneration that is skeptical of authority, is longing for independence and autonomy, and is not only skeptical of authority, but likes to challenge authority because they may not have agreed with all of the different restrictions and protocols that were in place while they were in that time period and at that age. So to get back to your conversation about the we versus the me, I think that pre-COVID, amongst Gen Z, there was very much this idea that Gen Z was supposed to save us all, and young people were super liberal and on the forefront of these social movements, and they felt a responsibility to be fighting for someone else. And that empathy is still there. And I think that, as I said, social media has allowed Gen Z to see into the lives of other people. And across the political ideological spectrum, I still see empathy as a core Gen Z value for both Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0. But there is a slight difference in how they are expressing that. And I think that Gen Z 2.0 on the whole is much more focused on the day-to-day lived experience of what it means to be a young person in this country today, and is prioritizing issues, and even just their way of thinking is more individualized. And it doesn't mean that they don't care about their neighbors or friends or classmates or peers, but I think they look at the activism of Gen Z 1.0 and say, where did that get them? Many of the issues that Gen Z 1.0 was fighting for, including the ones that I named, whether it be things like immigration or climate change or reproductive healthcare access or gun safety, there hasn't been much progress made on those issues in the way that the people who were advocating for those issues would have liked. And so I think that members of Gen Z 2.0 wonder what the point of all that activism was if it didn't get these activists where they wanted to be. So that's a part of this too, and something that I think is often left out of the conversation.
How much of this do you think is just sort of natural rebellion? That's a question that I get a lot, actually. And I remember for sort of Gen Z 1.0 cohort, when we came with the lab, we got a lot of questions from clients around this generation just seems like they don't want to work anymore. And I still think that that's a stereotype of Gen Z. And part of the way that I explained it is, look, for millennials, there's so much hustle culture. There's so much lean in culture, Sheryl Sandberg, all of that. And during COVID, a lot of people were laid off. And for Gen Z, people act rationally. Gen Z took that in and they said, what's the point? All of this sort of leaning in, this hustle isn't working. So yeah, I'm not going to give 110% of my job. I'm going to get 80%, try not to get fired, but I'm going to live my life. So part of me wonders if that's what's happening here.
Yes, I think I'm going to break what you just set up into sort of two parts. So on the first part, in terms of the workplace conversation, I think that Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 have a slightly different relationship to a before time. And Gen Z 1.0 remembers a time pre-COVID, and COVID completely changed our paradigm of what is acceptable in the workplace, what isn't, what it means to be working from home. That wasn't so much of a thing before the pandemic happened. And it also, I think, changed the relationships that people have with their bosses. And a under layer to all of this is mental health and work-life balance. And I think that the pandemic and the way that it shifted the paradigm of what it means to be an employee in this country, it gave a lot of power back to the employees, because suddenly these standards that had been in place forever didn't have to be that way. And work from home was a reasonable alternative. And it still is. Even though many companies have returned to the office, there are still young people who will look for jobs that are completely remote. And there are companies that operate completely remotely. And even for companies that are back in the office, there are, ways to work from home where you can have a week of, maybe it would typically be considered vacation, but now you're working from the vacation and you can work from different locations. And it's just much more flexible. So I think that changed this generation's relationship to work. But Gen Z 2.0 never was in a workplace prior to COVID. So they only know a world in where those post-COVID norms exist. And that is true of the academic experience as well. In terms of just the work-life balance and mental health conversations, I've been really struck, especially in my recent conversations with young people, particularly recent high school and college graduates. I did a big class of 2025 report for the Up and Up in June, where I talked to high school and college graduates in listening sessions and what I call a reality check. And one of the biggest themes that I heard from the students who were graduating at the time was that when they think about what comes next, they're really prioritizing their mental health, their well-being, and they want to work really hard, but they also want to have time where they can have for themselves, with their families, with their friends, where they're taking time to recharge. I do still think that Gen Z is a hustle-driven generation. I'm seeing this translate a lot more into entrepreneurialism. And that's one of the biggest differences that I see between Gen Z 1.0 and Gen Z 2.0 as well, is that while Gen Z 1.0 leaned into activism, Gen Z 2.0 is leaning into entrepreneurship. And I think that perhaps because of those social movements that didn't turn out the way that the activists wanted them to, or didn't lead to the results that perhaps they wanted to, young people today are looking at the world's problems, understanding that there are plenty of them, but they're looking for more entrepreneurial solutions to solve them rather than policy-driven activism.
That's so interesting. I want to double click on Gen Z 2.0 and politics. I think for me, that's the most interesting headline that you've talked about that's going to be up in our report. And really the upshot of this is that Gen Z, the sort of stereotype is that they're very, very left-leaning. Gen Z 2.0 absolutely bucks that trend and is much more right-leaning. There was an 11-point spread in the most recent election between U.S. Gen Z 2.0ers voting more Republican than Democrats. So I'd love to get a sense from you of just wrapping my head around Gen Z 2.0 and their politics. What do they stand for? What do they care about? And if you have a sense of if you think this is going to stay consistent or if it might change over time.
Yeah, and I think that last part of your question, too, about whether it stays consistent or changes over time gets back to something you mentioned before about the pushback to those in power and in positions of authority in this rebellion culture, which has been key to Gen Z 2.0. When you look at Gen Z 2.0's politics, there has been this major shift to the right amongst young people. It may have allowed them to vote for Trump as a first-time voter in the 2024 election or to consider themselves part of the MAGA movement. But these are not loyal Republicans. They are not loyal conservatives. They just so happen to vote for Trump in this election. And I really want to be clear about that because when I have conversations with young voters, overwhelmingly, whether they're in Gen Z 1.0 or Gen Z 2.0, they do not like either party. They do not want to associate with either party. There are very few people who actually feel that they have a lot in common with the political leaders on either sides. There's a lot of political homelessness and an overwhelming sense of frustration with the political system writ large. I think that is even more pronounced for Gen Z 2.0, who just feels lost in between. And yes, we saw President Trump make inroads with young people and young men in particular because he welcomed them into the conversation and was very willing to embrace new media. There's been so much conversation, probably too much conversation about the manosphere and the way that Trump went on this podcast tour, which was super smart and super savvy. But the young people who are listening to those podcasts are not all Republicans. The young people listening to those podcasts are not all paying attention to politics. And I think that's the key factor here, too, is that Trump did a really good job of politically coding culture. So he went to these cultural places and just had a normal conversation. He was a normal guy. He talked about sports. He talked about things that are in culture. He talked about his son, Barron. He talked about all of his children. He talked about his family. There was very little conversation about policy. Young people want someone who is willing to talk to them, who is willing to say, hey, I understand where you're coming from on X, Y, or Z. I want to have a conversation with you. But it doesn't mean that everyone listening to these podcasts is a Republican. In general, this is a cohort who is very skeptical of authority. Like I said, they were coming of age during the pandemic. They were the guinea pigs of lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccine rollouts. And there was a lot of contradictions that leaders put out during that time that didn't make sense for young people. This is a very in tune, in touch, and subgeneration that's paying a lot of attention and also felt the ramifications of those protocols on their day-to-day lives. And in order for a politician to have clout with Gen Z, they need to pass their sniff test. This subgeneration is really good at sniffing out BS, and they are very issue focused. And the number one issue for young people that has been completely overlooked and now is a part of the conversation, but it wasn't, was the economy and economic anxiety. And I think that Gen Z on the whole right now is prioritizing the economy. They always have for some reason, and maybe because the most visible Gen Zers who had a political opinion were the ones who were on the forefront of those social movements that I discussed. I think that was part of why politicians and Democrats in particular thought that they had to talk about climate change and gun violence and abortion in order to reach young people. But in reality, and this goes back to your me versus we, young people are prioritizing the economy because if they can't afford the cost of living, their college education, a home, starting a family, how are they even going to think about anything else? That is what I hear over and over again. And this has only gotten more prominent in my listening sessions since the 2024 election. And so to your question about will this last or will they flip, this generation will vote for whomever is talking to them about the issues that matter to them. In 2024, let's just be clear, Kamala Harris still won with young voters, but Trump did make inroads because he was willing to go to the places where young people were listening and talk about his life, who he is, but also the economy in a way that Democrats didn't keep up with. But I think that Democrats are paying attention to this. And if you look at a candidate like Zohran Mamdani in New York City, he is expressing a lot of the same sentiments that Donald Trump did in the 2024 election, and he's resonating with young people too. And so that just goes to show that Gen Z on the whole, but Gen Z 2.0 in particular, is not party aligned, is not necessarily all liberal or all conservative. In fact, they're issue focused, they're focused on the economy, and they want a politician who's going to address the issues that they feel are present in their day-to-day lives.
This resonates very deeply with research that we've done. And I've gotten that question before of how much of this is young people versus, fundamental traits. And I think to your point, the areas that people felt threats were coming in from, which is COVID-19, which is social injustice, all of these things has migrated into more individualized economic anxiety. But the red thread between those things, you're responding to different threats, but you are under threat and you are under siege. And for me, that's the red thread between Gen Z is really drawing on this fundamental need for safety and security. I still have so many questions to ask you, but unfortunately we're at time. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. This was an incredible conversation. To our listeners, this month we will actually be releasing the second installment of our Gen Zeitgeist report, where we'll explore Rachel's theory on Gen Z 1.0 versus the 2.0 dynamic with research supported by our Trust Barometer findings. So please follow Edelman's websites and social channels to receive updates. And of course, thank you all for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.